You have to watch this before it's too late, as the extreme left tries to enforce limits on our speech and attempts to find ways to suppress our natural rights. Only few people like Jordan Peterson have the character to go on panels and dismantle their arguments on why the path to modern society is this dangerous. Freedom of speech should not be a subject of debate to start with, as it's an integral part of any functioning democracy, and any attempt to censor speech should be pushed back against. Just take a look at this before we get into it.
I think that sometimes the distinction between abusive speech and abusive action can be an artificial distinction. You might say, why is it wrong to be abusive about politicians and send them racist and sexist stuff online? It doesn't matter. All their threats will never happen. But Parliament saw one of our colleagues, Joe Cox, killed. And that sort of action, it's not necessarily the consequence of abusive language, but it is related to abusive language. On the Grenfell Tower thing, I don't think it should be a crime unless the police learn stuff that I don't know. But please, I met a number of those people who died, who had to see their relatives die in Grenfell Tower, who ran down those steps over dead bodies from Grenfell Tower. And I think it is horrific what was done. May not be a crime, but utterly horrific. If you understand the reality of Grenfell Tower, you know it utterly detestable and wrong. But as I say, you can't just say, well, you can call people, it doesn't really matter. It has no relationship to anything else. That type of abusive language does have a relationship to actions which are genuinely harmful and damaging and cruel. And I think sometimes when people are dismissive about, racist and sexist language, they need to be careful, because what you do is you create a climate where certain actions become legitimate.
Jordan Peterson.
Oh, I know in Scotland the police had put up advertisements in the tube encouraging people to turn people in for offensive behavior online. It seems to me, for example, if you're concerned about knife crime, then maybe one of the things you don't want to do is have your police investigating offensive speech. And one of the things I do see happening in the UK as an outsider that's really quite terrifying to me is that there are increasing restrictions put on people's ability to speak forthrightly, and that the consequence of that restriction and the criminalization of what hypothetically constitutes offensive speech is going to be a cure that's so much more worse than the disease that we can hardly imagine it. It's a dreadful thing to see that happening in the UK. And so, people say things that are reprehensible all the time, but we can't always agree on what they are. But to start to criminalize it's hypothetical.
In recent years, there's been a growing trend led by the far left towards imposing restrictions on speech deemed offensive or hurtful under the guise of promoting tolerance and inclusivity. This trend is deeply troubling and undermines the very essence of free expression. First and foremost, it's essential to recognize that freedom of speech encompasses the right to express opinions and ideas that may be controversial, unpopular, or offensive to some. This principle is clearly spelled out in democratic constitutions and legal frameworks around the world, precisely because it protects minority viewpoints and, most importantly, ensures that dissenting voices are not silenced or marginalized. A recent report from the Future of Free Speech think tank examined 22 of the world's leading democracies and over 200 legislative developments regarding free speech in the 7-year time span. Remember, we're talking about countries like Australia, Norway, the United States, and the results are shocking to say the least. The report found that from 2015 to 2022, 78% of the legal developments across those democracies were meant to restrict freedom of speech rather than protect it. The grounds for those restrictions were largely imposed in the name of the national security, with Denmark leading the list. I think the left has to understand that the trajectory we're on is a scary one, and the freedoms we enjoy today didn't come out of nothing. Those are the results of continuous struggles. In a diverse society, it is inevitable that individuals will encounter ideas and opinions that will conflict with their own beliefs or values. However, the appropriate response to speech that is perceived as hurtful or offensive is not censorship, but rather open debate and critical engagement. How else is society supposed to go forward? The imposition of restrictions on free speech is counterproductive and ultimately ineffective in addressing the underlying issues of social problems. Rather than silencing offensive speech, we should strive to address the root causes of such issues through education, dialogue, and social change. By promoting a culture of open discourse and mutual respect, we can challenge harmful ideologies and build more inclusive and equitable societies.
Are you saying nothing that anybody says should ever be counted as a crime?
Well, there's incitement to crime. that should be counted as a crime and has been for a very long time in the British common law tradition. But other than that, you should be very careful about what you regulate as speech. Who's going to regulate it? Who's going to define hate? That's the real issue. It's not that there's not hate. There's plenty of it. The question is, who defines hate and how is it prosecuted?
I'm not frightened of forthright speech. I'm quite a forthright speaker myself. But when you talk about who's going to define hate, you want to see the letters and emails I see day after day and tell me that's not hate.
Hang on. There was somebody fined under the Communications Act earlier this year because he posed a video on YouTube of a dog doing a kind of Nazi salute, and he shouted in the background. And he was fined, and it was a criminal prosecution. Is that right in your view?
I didn't think that was right, no. I think it was a big mistake. I mean, I followed that case fairly carefully, and you don't have to agree that what he did was comical or right, but to prosecute him criminally was a big mistake, and you're going to pay for it in this country.
Just take a minute to let that sink in. I think we're headed towards a pure Orwellian society. He tried to warn us from the Big Brother in 1984, but now the left is just cheering for it. What we're talking about here is censoring speech based on feelings, not on real-world threats. This is fundamentally anti-free speech, as it undermines the principles of open discourse, intellectual freedom, and everything that democracy stands for. Peterson also raises a serious question: who decides what it is to be censored? The imposition of restrictions on free speech set a dangerous precedent by granting authorities the power to decide what is considered acceptable speech. Take this absurd case, for example. A Canadian man living in Australia was ordered by the Australian E-Safety Commissioner to take down a tweet against someone because he misgendered them. The E-Safety Commissioner went as far as threatening X to take down the tweet or else face a fine of 800,000 Australian dollars. Now, what is an E-Safety Commission, you might ask? It's a body that was established in 2015 to protect the safety of minors in Australia against cyberbullying and other cases. Their powers are not clearly defined, nor the scope or limit of their powers. I think it's also worth taking a look at historic evidence, which is full of examples of authoritarian regimes using censorship and repression to control public discourse and maintain their grip on power. More recent instances of this is the death of the Russian opposition figure Alexander Navalny in Russia, where Putin had him jailed for pure political reasons, with him ending up dead in prison due to sudden death syndrome, according to Russian authorities. In such an environment, genuine debate and the free exchange of ideas becomes constrained, and unpopular or controversial viewpoints are suppressed. This doesn't mean that individuals have the right to engage in hate speech or incite violence, which are rightly subject to legal restrictions, far from it. But it is evident that cases similar to the one mentioned earlier are increasingly happening over the last few years, and it opens the door to abuse of power and creates a slippery slope as those in positions of authority may seek to suppress dissenting opinions or viewpoints that challenge their rule or undermine their agenda. This leads to a negative effect on public discourse as individuals self-censor out of fear of saying something that could be deemed offensive or hurtful.